I already screwed this up once and thought I had recorded it and I didn't, so I'm having to do the entire thing over again. I apologize for this being so late and getting posted. We're going to get it done so you can get how to move on with your weekend and have some fun. So let's talk about the Republican resurgence and some of the highlights of what happened during FDR's presidency before World War II, which was called the New Deal. The post-war economy differed substantially from the one that preceded it. New products swept the markets and prices dropped considerably. Things that had once been obtained only by the wealthy were now purchased by the middle class. Innovations in communication were made a more homogeneous American society. Radios and movie theaters became commonplace, and they drove the American desire to talk the same, dress the same, and experience the same lifestyle they saw on the big screen. Since the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903, the use of planes had advanced slowly, from two country boys in North Carolina to government subsidies to develop planes as weapons. Flight experiences and exploration boomed. In World War I, they were originally used for reconnaissance, but were later made into fighters, and toward the end of the war, they were turned into bombers. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic solo. This would promote the feasibility of air travel. Still, automobiles were the most numerous and significant revolution in travel. Ford's assembly line production technique cut the cost of his Model T substantially and made cars affordable for a new generation of Americans who took advantage of the post-war boom. Henry Ford stated his aim was to democratize the automobile. When I'm through, everybody will be able to afford one, and about everyone will have one. He was right. The prices for a Model T dropped from $850 in 1908 to $290 in 1924, a testimony to the efficiency of his assembly line. Here's a picture of the assembly line right as they're dropping it down. The body is up on the top, as you can see it, and then they drop it down onto this assembly line and get it all hooked up and put together and ready to sell. Warren G. Harding became president in 1920. He felt America needed a healing time, a need for conservative values. He was a man who says that he was just a man of the people who came from a Protestant home. He was the son of an Ohio farmer. He just called himself a plain fellow who was old-fashioned and even reactionary in matters of faith and morals. However, that's not exactly how he lived. I told you he was smoking and drinking in the White House, flaunting the 18th Amendment as he served as president. Harding pushed for something called, quote, normalcy, which was his catchphrase, a contentment with things as they are. But Harding's administration was racked with corruption and scandal. He felt America needed healing from all of this time, but one of the major issues of his administration was the Teapot Dome scandal. The Teapot Dome was a government-owned oil deposit on federal land in Wyoming that was administered by the Interior Department. Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, let private companies exploit the oil there and was discovered to have taken bribes in order to allow the companies to have their way. This wasn't the only scandal that happened during Harding's presidency. We talked about a couple more of them during class. But while he was in Seattle, I told you he suffered a heart attack and he died in San Francisco. But not since the death of Abraham Lincoln had there been such an outpouring of grief for a beloved, kindly, ordinary man. And then later, all of these scandals come up as it's all published after he dies. Harding was succeeded by Vice President Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge pushed to promote free enterprise, to get rid of government involvement in business, and reduce taxes. The country at this time experienced a change in consumer goods. Things once only available to the wealthy were now more affordable due to the rerouting of the economy from financing World War I. They were putting all of that effort into producing products for the regular people. However, with the production of these enticing new goods, they would also produce economic havoc if people did not abandon their traditional notions of frugality and go on a spending spree. So what the economy was trying to do is tell people that they needed things, instead of saving their money, they needed to spend it and to buy all of these new contraptions, new things, washing machines and toasters and those kind of things that regular people just didn't really have, only the wealthy had up to this point. Coolidge also pushed to promote free enterprise, and he became very concerned that there were dangerous radical groups who he felt would turn America into a communistic and socialistic state, groups that were undermining the foundation of America. After Coolidge announced he would not run for a second term, the Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover. The Democrats nominated Alfred Smith, governor of New York. Smith was a Catholic, which led the KKK to campaign against him. The election was a 3-in-a-row Republican landslide victory for Hoover. When Hoover became president, he set his sights on propping up the agricultural sector, which Coolidge had refused to do. He would pass the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1929, releasing funds to assist farmers and to have them be able to buy surplus crops. A new tariff, the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, also raised duties to an all-time high. This was after the stock market crash. It raised those tariffs to nearly 40%. Even though he was petitioned by over 1,000 economists to veto the tariff, Hoover signed it under pressure from the Republican Party, and it became law. This tariff raised the prices for consumers and limited the ability for farmers to export their goods. They didn't really think that this would be a big deal. They thought that it wouldn't have any problems. It would solve many of their economic woes, and it didn't. He also approved the construction of the Hoover Dam as a way to help people get more money. The rapid growth of the economy in the post-war boom continued, and most Americans didn't even consider a drop in the markets. However, by 1929, the stock market had escalated beyond control, and many Americans bought into the gamble of speculation, except this time it was not land, but the purchase of stocks. Sometimes they would use their land as collateral to buy stocks on margin, quote unquote. We'll talk about that in class. They never considered the possibility that it could all end, but the stock market did crash. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed, shedding 37% of its value. Hoping that it would rebound, many sold and bought again, but only to be trapped by the falling market. Americans began to watch their expenditures more carefully, which means that they stopped buying and spending as much, so there was less money in circulation, and as a result, this initial panic turned into a depression, with 25% of the workforce unemployed. The stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression, but it did reveal the weaknesses of the American economic system. This is a picture of some kids who had nowhere to live. They used to call these little cardboard villages that they put up around the country, they used to call them Hoovervilles, and making fun of President Hoover and how he was unable to help any of the people. By 1933, about 13 million people were no longer employed, and those who still had jobs found themselves working fewer hours. Soup kitchens were created to feed the hungry. Local welfare agencies ran out of charity and funds. Thousands of unemployed men hopped trains in search of jobs. Known as hobos, they would continue on the rails until they found employment. Hoover tried to restore American confidence in the economy. In speech after speech, he encouraged the public to maintain hope, and he tried accelerating the start of government-funded construction projects to create jobs like the Hoover Dam. However, as these federal projects expanded, local and state government agencies continued to cut back and not spend as much money, and the benefits from the federal projects were offset by the local and state controls. This is a picture right here of some unemployed veterans called the Bonus Expeditionary Force. They went to Washington, D.C. in 1932 to stage a revolt. Their purpose was to get immediate payment of the cash bonus to 4 million war veterans that Congress had voted in 1924, and it was a life insurance payable in 1945, but they wanted to get it early. The rest, along with their wives and children, having no place to go after they had been rejected on Capitol Hill, camped in vacant government buildings in a shanty town within the site of Capitol Hill. But late in July, the administration ordered the shanty towns knocked down. The soldiers easily drove out the unarmed veterans and their families and burned the shacks. The spectacle of Army troops using tanks to dislodge unarmed veterans did not help Hoover's eroding political image, as you can imagine. They had suffered 3 years of the Great Depression by the time the election of 1932 came around. Hoover was hesitant to remedy the Depression. It wasn't part of the presidential powers laid out in the Constitution, but he tried to find some other solutions without throwing federal money directly at the problem. Hoover did attempt to remedy the effects, but they weren't successful. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, gave uplifting speeches as they were on the campaign trail, and people listened to him. He promised them change in what was called the, quote, New Deal. Roosevelt also had worked with Woodrow Wilson during his campaigns as well during Wilson's presidency. Roosevelt's views aligned similarly with Woodrow Wilson. During the campaigns, it became pretty heated, as campaigns normally do. Hoover warned the public about what he called Roosevelt's reckless proposals that would destroy the very foundation of the American system. That was his, way to attack FDR's policies. But FDR, however, said he thought most important, he recognized that a mature economy would require imaginative national planning. The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. He knew that we needed to try something that maybe had never been done before. But what came across to the voters was less the content of his speeches and and more was just his irrepressible confidence and his hope that something was going to be better, and the Americans really wanted to have something to hope for. Roosevelt made a pledge to the public. He said, "I pledge to you, to myself, a new deal for the American people." He won, and the New Deal began its course. When Roosevelt took office, 4 out of 5 of banks had closed, and the economy was on the verge of collapse. In his inauguration speech, FDR said that, quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," one of the most famous quotes ever given by a president. He also explained, "I will take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another." So he was going to just try throwing spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. If you've never heard that expression before, think about it. Throw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall. Some of it will stick. Most of it will slide to the ground, but you keep the ones that are stuck to the wall. And that was basically what he set out to do on his New Deal. His New Deal was a 3-pronged strategy. Banks would be propped up. The industrial complex would they would increase federal spending in the industry, and farm commodity prices would be raised to pay farmers to reduce their crops and herds, and thus the scarcity would raise prices, which is one of those basic laws of economics. It's not exactly what happened. In the first 100 days of his presidency, Congress passed more than a dozen of Roosevelt's major proposals, a body of legislation whose scope was unprecedented in American history. Also at this time, his second day in office, FDR got Congress to declare a 4-day bank holiday to allow the banking panic to subside. Along with the Emergency Banking Relief Act, FDR allowed banks to reopen only once they were able to prove that they were sound. Saving the banks was one of his major concerns at the beginning of his presidency, because if a nation's banks aren't working, then the country's finances aren't working. Also at this time, the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment, and the sale of alcohol was once again permitted. Also, by consolidating all of the federal farm credit agencies into one, FDR was able to lower the payments on farms so that the owners were better able and easier to keep their farms. While Hoover had opposed any direct federal assistance to the unemployed, FDR bypassed the states to directly aid those in need. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created to provide jobs for unmarried males between the ages of 18 and 25. They planted trees and did assorted projects like building roads, bridges, and that kind of thing. The FERA, which was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, was also created at this time to help with the suffering inflicted by those with no income and no available jobs, because they would drive all over the country trying to find a job. Nobody could find a job. FERA funds created jobs by financing state construction of over 5,000 buildings and 7,000 bridges, organized adult literacy programs, financed college education for poor students, and set up daycare centers for low-income families. Thus, this is the beginning of the alphabet agencies, as they're called. By paying people after they completed jobs instead of paying money to the unemployed, FDR hoped to prevent a generation of idlers on the government dole, which means being on the dole means that you're receiving a handout from the federal government without having done anything in return. Another one of his alphabet agencies is the Agriculture Adjustment Act, AAA, of 1933. It sought to raise the prices of crops and herds by paying farmers to reduce their production. After the Great War, governmental funds were no longer used to help farmers plant crops after we pulled out of the war. And the farmer found himself in debt with a surplus of crops. The overproduction of land and the then rapid decline in prices forced many farmers to neglect their fields. Coupled with a vast drought in the Central Plains, this led to the Dust Bowl, in which thousands of pounds of topsoil was gathered by winds and swept as far away as Washington, D.C. Picture a haboob like we get here in Arizona, but 10 times, 1,000 times worse. Later, the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act was added by the government in an attempt to contain the Dust Bowl. Also created at this time by FDR was the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, which dealt with economic recovery and public works projects. The PWA, the Public Works Administration, created by the NRA, built bridges, roads, and flood control systems and made improvements to the internal infrastructure. Another part of the act, the National Recovery Administration, worked to stabilize businesses by regulating wages and prices and establishing workplace standards. The New Deal did not end the Depression. By 1939, over 17% of the labor force was still unemployed, so we've gone down from 25% to 17%. A decade-long drought in the 30s spawned a human and environmental catastrophe known as the Dust Bowl. It affected the Great Plains of Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. Tilled land left by the farmers who could not afford to plant, coupled with drought and the high winds, resulted in what was called black blizzards. By 1938, about 25 million acres of prime farmland had lost most of its topsoil. Farmers in this area migrated to the cities to find employment, but would rarely find jobs. We also had in the White House, not only did we have this strong president, but we had a strong first lady. And Eleanor Roosevelt redefined the role of the presidential spouse. She was the first woman to address a national political convention, to write a nationally syndicated column, and to hold regular press conferences. The public really loved her. She was an advocate. She was a progressive advocate for a lot of those progressive programs. FDR was an acclaimed hero to many of his day, and even now. Of course, there's always more than one angle to look at his programs. Those who it benefited were thrilled, while most of FDR's New Deal programs were outside his constitutional authority. We'll talk about that in class. The Supreme Court did kill many of his acts, such as the National Industrial Recovery Act. FDR found the greatest roadblock to his New Deal during the Great Depression, and that was the judicial branch of the federal government, which struck down the new powers taken by Congress to regulate interstate interactions. When it became apparent that the New Deal was unable to end the Great Depression, criticism of FDR's plans began to emerge. Many sought the limelight to attack FDR with their own plans, such as Senator Huey Long, known in Louisiana as the Kingfish. His Share the Wealth program advocated for an idea similar to Robin Hood, steal from the rich to give to the poor. His Share the Wealth program proposed to confiscate large personal fortunes, guarantee every family a cash grant of $5,000 and every worker an annual income of $2,500, provide pensions to the aged, reduce working hours, pay veterans bonuses, and ensure a college education for every qualified student. So that was his idea of what to do, one idea to how to solve the problems. The Townsend Recovery Program, which was suggested by Francis Townsend, he promoted a plan to pay $200 a month to every citizen over the age of 60. This plan itself would have cost more than half the nation's income and help only 9% of the populace. But Townsend stated that, "I'm not in the least interested in the cost of the plan," he told the House committee. However, it was eventually passed by FDR, a kind of a changed idea of this program, which became Social Security. The Social Security Act of 1935 was the New Deal's cornerstone and supreme achievement. It proved to be the most significant and far-reaching of all the New Deal initiatives. It was, FDR wore it a little bit as a badge of honor that he got this passed. There were three major provisions of Social Security. Number one is that it would have a federally administered pension for retired people over the age of 65. Number two, the federal and state unemployment insurance the cost of that would be shared and would be financed by a payroll tax on employers, which they pass it on to their employees. So if you're looking at your W-2 form or when you get your paycheck, they often take out this unemployment insurance, and that's one of the things that it goes to. And the third thing is that that Social Security would remain a state responsibility while the national government would provide work relief. So it was going to be the state's responsibility to find ways to finance the program for those who were retired, and the federal government would find work relief for those who were able to work. The long-term legacies of the New Deal, one of the primary problems with the New Deal is as FDR was president for longer and longer, when he was running for his second term in 1936, the Supreme Court had ruled against many New Deal programs in 7 of the 9 major cases that had been reviewed. For this reason, Roosevelt decided to change the court's conservative stance by enlarging the court, a move for which there was ample precedent and power, because Congress, not the Constitution, determines the size of the court, and there's no number given in the Constitution about how many justices can serve. At different times, it had numbered 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 justices. In 1937, there were 9. FDR decided he wanted to create 50 new federal judges at the federal level, and then he wanted to get the court up to 15 judges. So he wanted to add 6 more Supreme Court judges. his opponents called this court packing, and it backfired. They wouldn't let him do it, and this kind of ticked off Roosevelt. However, it fractured the Democratic Party, and it gave a little bit of dent to FDR's reputation. The whole New Deal really went up in smoke as a result of this Supreme Court fight over court packing. So it kind of got weak there in 1936, but people still reelected him for 2 more terms, 1936 and again in 1940. The legacy of the New Deal, there was effective opposition to the New Deal emerging as early as 1936. And the Republicans, by the end of 1937, they had a big anti-New Deal bloc had developed in Congress. So they were trying to fight it in Congress by the middle of 1937. By the end of the 1930s, the power of the national government, however, was vastly larger than it had been in 1932, and hope had been restored to people who had grown disconsolate. So a lot of people, even though the unemployment was still high, depression was still going on, people were feeling a little bit better, but it was because of how big the federal government had grown. FDR and the New Dealers went beyond the concept of regulated capitalism by insisting that the government not simply respond to social crises, but that the government take positive steps to avoid a crisis. So the government was going to take care of business and how to avoid problems that comes with business and the economy. To this end, the New Deal's various benefit programs sought to ensure a minimum level of well-being for all Americans. So it established this new idea that all Americans should be at no lower than a certain level of prosperity. Also, Roosevelt sharply increased the regulatory functions of the federal government, and he laid the foundation for what would become an expanding welfare system. The New Deal represented a halfway revolution that permanently altered the nation's social and political landscape. It made the people reliant on the government to help them for solutions. It created a whole layer of agencies that started administering federal programs throughout the states and started to get the people more accustomed to having government's hand in their lives more frequently. So that's presentation number 9. We're going to have a class challenge in class on Monday or Tuesday, depending on which day you have class, about FDR's alphabet agencies. So I hope you took some good notes on that stuff. And your notes for presentations 8 and 9 will be checked in class this next time. So I hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy your time off, and I will see you